So good morning. I'm Molly Quinlan-Hayes with the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response and the Performing Arts Readiness Project, and happy to continue this series of interviews with leaders in the field about arts organizations at a crossroads. And this morning, I'm very happy to be speaking with Deborah Gilpin of the Madison Children's Museum. And Deb, would you please say hello, introduce yourself?
Well, hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here and an honor. I'm currently president and CEO of Madison Children's Museum, where I've been for 8 years. It happens to be my hometown, but I lived away for 30 years where I was in the Boston area and Phoenix in children's and science museums. So I have 34 years in museums and 25 of those as a CEO.
Great. Well, thanks again for being here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the museum?
Well, Madison Children's Museum is 40 years old, and it continues to really be at the top of its game in terms of award-winning, being typically in the top dozen children's museums in the country. There are about 350 children's museums in the country, and we're really proud to be a leader in so many ways. And the museum serves about 210,000 people a year. It's a typical year, and has a budget of about $3 million, and over time has developed an endowment and a reserve fund for facilities and various things that a mature organization should hopefully have in place. And we had about 74 employees, and I'll speak later about the scale of where we're at now and all those things.
Sure. Well, thank you. And I know that as part of your national work that you are connected with a couple of national museum networks. And so you'll be bringing some of that knowledge and perspective to this conversation. Is that right?
Yes, I served on the ACM board, the Association of Children's Museum Board, for many years, and continue to provide reviews and work with museums all over the country.
Great. Well, that's a wonderful wealth of knowledge and expertise you'll be bringing to our viewers. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the museum's journey over the last year and a half and just kind of the big milestones that you had to navigate through that time?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think ours aren't dissimilar to what everyone else has gone through, but there was a very crisp moment in time when we shut down the museum, when we identified it was time. And we went from 74 employees, I laid off 54 employees, ended up with 20 who worked half-time essentially for a year. And over a year, I should say. We had a couple of contracts in place that helped support several staff, but we owned our building. We own our building and our block. So our focus was to preserve our assets, our physical, fiscal, and human assets, and identify that someone had to go in and run the elevator and run the plumbing every week to keep things from deteriorating, taking care of that building and that site. So we went through initially that big down surge. We got both cycles of PPPs, which allowed us to initially bring many people back and do a focused effort in the community of doing sidewalk surprises, which was bringing physical activity to children out in neighborhoods. And staff and volunteers did this in their own neighborhoods. Because we're in a downtown city, we're subject to many of the rules that a city follows. And that initially was an extremely difficult row to hoe, because they were changing very quickly given COVID and given the riots that were happening in our towns and protests. So it was a fascinating time, and as a leader, extremely challenging. And to keep our staff safe, but to also still figure out how are we going to still serve our community. And we ended up finding several pieces through this. One of them that maybe is quite different from others was that we identified that we should not be doing a lot of virtual programming. It's our area is being hands-on, and there is a lot of online programming for children. And we felt, well, that's just not our space. We shouldn't take that up. So we went through this period of a year or so of sustaining, and 6 months after the pandemic we had identified that we should create a campaign that would fund both survival and then thriving to reopen and moving forward to get playing outside. And we happened to have a project in place that we were underway already with campaign and designs to do an outdoor active play space. We basically narrowed it much. We reduced its size. We identified how could we get this done by summer of 2021, and we set to work and launched a $4 million campaign last October. And here we are a year later, October, and we're going to be opening that space for outside play.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yes. And what we found was that the community really engaged with finding a way they could support the museum through these times, but it also really helped them to see how was this going to come back around to serving the community when we came out of our dark place again. So I'll go back to our path. We reopened the museum in June of 2021 with very low capacity, low attendance, and that's basically where we've been holding open, but with a limited hours and limited staff.
So your low attendance, I presume, is because you've set caps on that, not because there's been lack of demand. Is that right?
I think it's
both. Or is it a mix?
It's both. It's both. The caps we set are far lower than what fire code and public health would allow, because we identified what we thought the comfort level would feel like. And people are really self-regulating that. We're very communicative about what it feels like in the space and how we're limiting. Initially, we used ticketing to determine that, and we don't need to ticket anymore, but we can tell people have a sense of they've changed their behavior of when they visit because we've informed them about when it's busy.
Right, smart people in your community. Talk to me a little bit more about the new campaign, because I think that, and we're going to talk about governance and board leadership, but in my work on this project, I've been speaking with both board members and executives, and there's been a spectrum, of course, of the ways that people have looked at fundraising or the lack of in this time. Everything from, how dare we fundraise when there are so many health and literal survival and social justice needs, through obviously successes like yours. So can you kind of talk us through that conversation that you all had internally, and how that actually obviously played out successfully? But I'm sure that it wasn't just automatic, oh yeah, let's go raise $4 million. How did that conversation happen?
We made a very conscious effort to talk through how would we be perceived as we went to go fundraising, and should we even be fundraising at this time? And in the beginning, we didn't. We laid low. We invited organizations that had committed to sponsoring fall events to just convert that to be a donation. That was pretty easy. They'd already made those commitments, and everyone agreed to that. And we didn't feel like that was extra fundraising out when essential needs were so critical in our community. But what we came to identify by the time we launched this campaign was that our role in the healing of the community as we come out of this was going to be critical. We were essential for that. And so by fall, we floated that idea with a few of our major donors and community leaders, and they all felt exactly that's right. That's the resource we see you as in the community, and we must be sure you're there to provide that. So with the launch of the $4 million, half of that was all towards sustaining us to getting to the reopening those initial months where revenue will be low. And then the second half was for creating this new space. And I'm not sure it would have been successful without the two combined. I think that both a physical result, but also the community gathering and healing that we're offering.
Right. That's a really interesting observation. And I would be remiss if I didn't put a plug in here for NCAPER, the impetus behind this project, which, if folks don't know, it's a national coalition, a voluntary coalition of private and public agencies and individuals to create a national safety net for artists and arts organizations. And it really was birthed out after Katrina and Rita, out of the belief that the arts are central to community healing, that all disasters are local, and that only through local community work and connection, and artists are those best community connectors, can we all heal. So you've just kind of become a great advocate for what our purpose is. So thank you.
Yes, well, in our case, the third word in our mission is connect. So that's our priority. and healing fits right in with that.
Exactly. Great. I know that it had to be just one of the worst jobs in the world to be a CEO during the last year. So can you talk a little bit about how you managed? You and I have had, multiple conversations, and I've just been kind of awed at how you so gracefully managed the anxieties and the needs of and the pain of your staff. So can you talk a little bit about how you approached your team through these difficult times?
Well, gosh, it was, of course, an extremely hard time for CEOs. And a couple of things we did right off the bat was we reached out to our peers, our networks. So the Children's Museum nationally, we meet weekly. We still meet every other week, all CEOs of all over the country and world, in fact. And then regionally, we have 15 children's museums in Wisconsin and 5 more underway, more per capita than any other state. And we started weekly meetings as well. Both the CEOs had a meeting, but also the educators of those organizations started meeting. And that was just invaluable to all of us. But I think we all, my starting point through all of this has been tied to kindness and humanity, and how do we support each other and get through this. And I think that showed up in the work that people were willing to do to support the museum, to ensure that it gets through it. They worked so hard through their own personal challenges, and we found ways to listen and support those, but also to let people have the space they needed. I think
what did that actually look and feel like? Obviously, you couldn't all be together. That was one of the hardest parts. So how did you kind of help folks manage that when you weren't able to be together?
Well, this was part of the figuring it out that was really rewarding, which is that, so in order to keep this very thin institutional knowledge, we were so down to one person knew how to do each thing, or less than that. Was if you're only working half time, how do we be sure you are not working the rest of the time? And we identified what days we would be working. How do we communicate our schedules, and then leave each other alone during the rest of the time? And that was a really good practice that we're continuing to do now. And part of it has to do with saying that, okay, even though you're salaried, we're not expecting you to just work all the time. We go for the 40-hour-a-week when you're full-time, if that's what your commitment is. And if you're doing more than that, then let's help you prioritize to get to that. And I think that's unusual in nonprofits. We tend to really burn out that staff and expect a lot more hours of them. And all of our people have personal lives that are very rewarding and bring richness to everything they do for the museum. So we needed to help them figure out that part of their lives as well.
That's great. That's great. I know also that you took this time to kind of step back, and knowing that you would have come out of this with a smaller staff, something that you said is going to be, I think, typical for the museum field and perhaps for arts organizations in general. But that means that you need to, again, shift your expectations. Also speaking to that thinness of institutional memory. And, as part of this toolkit, we're offering a section on knowledge capture and transfer, this idea of how do you build in both the mindset and the time to have that download time, that sharing time, so that it isn't just one person who knows how to fix the boiler, one person who knows what when to call how to call the elevator company, or one person who has the relationship with your major foundation. So I know that was primary in your mind, both that and dealing with some hierarchical issues. So
Yes.
I'd love for you to talk about how that realization came to you and how you've been shifting some of the internal capacity issues.
Well, leadership, as we went through pandemic and had our senior team conversations, had identified, we'd already identified that we were a little bit siloed, and we were not just top heavy, but overstaffed. We were producing 1,200 programs a year, and we didn't have good accountability and good metrics for how we make decisions about our activities. We love our community. We saw great things we could do, and we kept trying to do everything. And it was a little bit of a function. We had moved into a bigger museum 10 years prior, and you say yes to everything. But it was time to start saying no more. And so we'd already recognized this. So the pandemic really brought this amazing opportunity to reset all that. So as we began to do our strategy, which was really, I'll call it January, when it got a little more solidified, when we could see that there was going to be a reopening in sight, we did strategic work with the board and identified that using a measure what matters model, a much more data-driven, evidence-based decision-making for what we would and wouldn't do and how we would respond to what we learn as the changing scenario happened as we reopened, was the way to go. And so we identified very crisp objectives and key results that board and staff agreed on. And some are higher level, like having how many months of operating cash in the bank that we won't know until a rolling number of months. And others are, we want a net promoter score of 75%. Or once we start opening the doors again, or we want to collect surveys from at least 50% of the visitors to find out. So we initiated all these things as we reopened, and we trained staff, and they really have had to learn to flex their different muscles about how to get to these outcomes. But what it's done is given them a sense of control and knowledge, transparency about the outcomes and how it might shape their job later, because we can identify merit raises with this. Because of this accountability, we can do that better. They're watching as the surge may come now and looking at, well, what they already know about our condition, and they don't feel as stressed as I think I'm hearing from other organizations, because they know the dollars involved. They know that we're making our number on the revenue per person through the front door, because they're tracking it themselves every week and meeting about it and changing their behavior to change those outcomes.
That's true. It really gives them a sense of power. And you've said that it also is freeing you up to do other things. And it's striking to me. It seems that with a smaller staff, you actually are building more capacity. Is that, do you think that's an accurate?
Yes, and it's very intentional. It really was about empowering more people to make decisions. I think over time it had gotten where decisions get pushed up to the leadership more frequently. And that's just, we recognized we had great people. We didn't need to, we needed to shift that. And part of bringing some of the frontline people back, we weren't sure we were going to bring the experienced, the prior employees back. And we did end up bringing them back, but we really worked with them to say, the culture is going to be different and you need to be on board for this. And they were, and they have been. And it's been really a beautiful thing to watch. And I don't think without a really significant reset, it would have happened as successfully. It's not something you can incrementally do very easily. It really was just a big switch that we're all on board for.
Right. We'll ask you to speak to a couple of very granular things that I think are really interesting lessons for the rest of us in the field. Talk about your how you reapproached compensation and kind of pipelines for junior staff or entry-level staff, if you would.
Right. So we pretty much threw the organizational chart out the window and said, we're a startup now. Get everybody doing the things we need doing, and then we'll figure out what departments are 6 months later. So that's a little exaggeration, but we had marketing as front desk staff and then floor staff as in education. And we made a visitor services area for now. And those frontline levels were $10 an hour, which was in our region appropriate, but we bumped that up to $14 an hour. We also converted more of them to be full-time instead of part-time positions, so they get benefits. So we had known we should do this in the past. We just couldn't make the jump. So that's been a wonderful thing to do. And then now what we're doing, we recognize that creates some compression for everyone above. And we're doing a formal compensation study now with a contractor to look at the other pay ranges, and by the beginning of our January 1st next budget cycle, we will be implementing, even if we can't do it all at once in this budget level, we'll have a plan to work that, level that up. Mm-hmm.
And talk about your new kind of cross-training opportunities and how you have built that in and incentivized. Right. I think is really very.
So one of the things that happened is we lost people with really important knowledge. So for example, we had a very active facility rental program. We would have 20 weddings a year and executive cocktail hours and all kinds of things. Well, all of that is gone, and it's not back yet either, although we have a dozen people who kept their wedding deposits with us and now are going to have their weddings on our site outside, and we don't have any of that staff anymore. They're all gone, and we don't, and it's not appropriate to bring them all back. We don't have the job to give them. It's not enough of a consistent job. So that's one area where we've said to everyone who's already on staff, would you like this other piece of your job as part of the hours you work to serve this other area, this revenue driving area? And they're raising their hands. And I think of this as juice. It's the thing that you don't do in your normal everyday job that is fun for you and different, but it makes you a better staff member in all ways. So anytime someone trains in a new area for a new skill, they get a pay bump, and then they become part of that larger pool of people who can be staffed for that activity.
That gives you so much more flexibility and resiliency, really, at the end of the day.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see over time, as some of those people would leave, they now hold a lot of institutional knowledge as well. But what we hope it means is that more people, there are more layers for every area of knowledge.
Right. And talk about your Karma Committee.
Oh yeah, this is something we formed when I got there. Well, we had it in Phoenix as well. I started it there, and it really just is good karma among the staff. So we hand it off to some group of 5 or 6 people on staff who agreed to serve on it for 2 years. We give them a budget, and they do whatever they think will be great for us. So we have things like chip dip-offs, contests, competitions, let's all go bowling, the social events, and not so much things like Employee of the Year. It's much more just more fluid. And one of them, for example, and they just come up with these and they use their budget for it. And the budget was a really freeing thing for them. It's like $400. It's not a lot of money, but they do so much with it. We have a critter, a chameleon plush that secretly travels around to different people's offices or places of work. And when you get it, you need to take a picture of it with you somewhere in your life outside the museum, and then post it to staff, and then you pass it on to someone else secretly. And it really means we learn about each other. It's not like Facebook, but it does connect people in that way. So there's little things like that I would have never come up with.
That's lovely. Yeah. Sounds like a great place to work. When you're hiring, let me know. Of course, you couldn't do this with your own CEO magic wand. You have a board of directors. Yes. So why don't we kind of shift to that? And if you could talk a little bit about, firstly, their kind of role, your engagement with them. I know they've had to walk a very difficult path along this. Yeah. And then we're going to talk a little bit about your planning mode. But let's start with just kind of what's been your journey with them.
The board journey was so fascinating. So we had a large board. I had 23 board members at the time that this happened. And initially, I would say the first 6 months, there were 5 or 6 of them who gave us so much time. They were the ones, the finance, who helped us find every resource that we could find, and also did all the crunch work of getting the data there to secure these dollars. The government, this level of producing government grants and applications, none of us work at that level of, at least our organization does. So, and someone who's HR of a major company helped so much behind the scenes in terms of what I would say to staff and what we were promising and not promising and all that. So that was incredible. And then it got kind of dark. They were not as engaged. We were all Zooming in for these meetings, and we just disconnected. So by spring, it was really dysfunctional. And I think that the last of the conversations in the spring were very fiduciary. There was not generative thinking happening. There was not strategic thinking happening on the board together as a group. And then as we reopened, we had our first in-person meeting in June, ended up being hybrid, and that was really challenging. So we're still working on that. But we've dropped down to a much smaller board. We're down to 19 board members, and we've agreed that that's good, and we should get even smaller. And partly that has to do, we were in a campaign mode before that, so we needed the larger board. But we're also carving down to no more than 4 committees, and we'll do ad hoc or task force. So some of this is best practices that we've been hearing from Board Source and others for years about way boards should operate. And again, or similarly with the board, it's a moment in time to bring about those changes.
You know, I just want to observe one thing, which is to look at the size of your board as a fluid thing. And I think so, well, as you said with the staff too, you know, you get to a certain point and you find the work to fill that, or you let, you know, all of that conversation happen at a board meeting because everyone needs to, you know, their voice heard, and that's great. But there comes a time when you need those things to ebb and flow, and to recognize and say that explicitly gives you the power to, you know, to move it, and it takes the personal away from it. So I just wanted to observe that, because I think it's an important thing for boards to, being a board member myself. So as a staff member, I think it's important to think about. So
I want to add, I serve on the board of a nature center and nature preschool, and we had done strategic planning and everything we had. I led that committee, and as we came through pandemic, everything we had decided played out so beautifully, because we opened the nature preschool in fall of 2020. So kids outside. So there was such this lack of childcare, and then here we had this new preschool where they were outside all day. Such an important service to the community. But watching that board behaved completely differently from my board at the museum. It's a much smaller board, and they were very tight through all of this, and they stayed on the higher level. And I think part of it is because they were a smaller board. I also think kudos to that executive director. He really communicated in the best possible way to us as board members. I think he did a better job in choosing what he invited board members in to be a part of and what he took care of.
Great. And I will, we'll add to this article for viewers some URLs, and I'll do a link to the wonderful Board Source book that talks about the different phases of board work, moving from fiduciary to strategic to generative. And if that's not a concept you're familiar with, it's a wonderful conversation to have and way to look at your growth over time. Let's see, strategic planning, right? Not the same as it was a year ago.
Right.
What has your strategic planning been like in terms of your horizon for planning, and how is the conversation different now than it was before?
Yeah, great question. We've been doing this very limited time frame. We basically did a 6-month strategic plan last spring, and we called it opening season. And now we're moving into how do we extend it longer. So on the one hand, we're planning on creating quarterly timeframes of objectives and key results, but then also creating the overlying 2 to 3 year, or maybe 3 to 5 year strategic plan with the board, full board involvement. So tying the two together. And one of the things that happened for us, and speaking about board members' roles, we have a board member who is with a major insurance firm who does this. They're called Ignite, but they do this. Sometimes it's Lean, sometimes it's Sigma 6. It's these productive ways of approaching your business. And we have been getting volunteer coaching and training in that all through this. And they'll lead our strategic work coming forward as well, and with board and staff. So our hope is to work through this winter by January, February, to be at a place where we see a 2 to 3 year plan ahead of us. And we don't know how much detail it's going to be able to have. But we do know that if we want to do a major exhibition, it takes 2 or 3 years to create one. And so I know that's one pin in the calendar that we'll be putting in there.
Right. That's
the
great.
The other ones are more about, I think the other one that's going to stand out is a commitment to ensuring and evaluating how we are helping our community heal. That this is a priority role for us. So how do we know if we're succeeding at it?
Right, great. So it is feasible to do strategic planning in our time. Although it's interesting, I was talking to a client yesterday, and it's a theater presenting organization in Pennsylvania, and they were talking about the fact that they did all the scenario planning, financially, staff-wise, programmatically. The one, and it was, what if, COVID, lasts, forever? What if we can't open? But all of the reopenings were really when COVID went away. And that the one scenario was not that we are going to open and COVID is still here. Yeah. And so is that a conversation that you all,
we don't do scenario planning. I do think the way we're thinking about our strategy work is more about deciding on a strategic position. So it's the approach we will take to things, not so much this is what we will do.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm looking at some of my notes to talk to you about. Let's see.
Access and diversity, inclusion and equity.
Yes, please. Yes, please talk about that. As you mentioned, COVID and all this need to look at our work in social justice, combined. And I know that you were very thoughtful about that. So will you just speak about it?
Sure. We had done quite a bit of work in the last 6 years working with Cultural Competency Learning Institute and having racial justice training for all of the staff, changing our practices. We'd been getting a lot of notoriety in our community and region, in the business community, who was looking to us for how could they diversify their staffs. And we'd made so much progress over the years. So we did it through very focused, intentional programs. One, for example, was a teen workforce program where in 5 years, we'd had 60 students, teens of color, high schoolers, come through as summer workforce, fully paid staff, with support systems in place, meetings with leaders of color in our community, so all the pieces that it takes to support a teenager in their first job, plus a teenager who, the things we learned through our initial evaluations, where some of these kids said, I've never been to the square, my family does not come downtown. And now them and their siblings and their family come and play in the museum, or they come to see their sibling working. And it's changed the trajectory of these families' travel in the community, in the wider community than the neighborhoods they lived in. So in any case, when I laid off 54 people, we were left with no one of color, no one who was non-binary, mostly women. It was the most heartbreaking thing to me of all the metrics that happened with our people. So as we rebuilt, we're now up to 31 staff. We won't go back up to 70. We maybe will get to 45 when we're busy again. But we had to work really hard to sustain that diversity, and it helped. We've been able to bring back a diverse staff, and I would say that it's the number one commitment we have to how we're rehiring, because people were noticing what we did, and we need to make sure there's no reason to step backward in that, especially as we want to be. What we saw happen when we we're doing well in this area was that our visitors also changed. Our visitors became more diverse, and the perception about us in the community as an organization shifted.
Yeah, well, I think certainly, that those years of trust and relationship that you built up, I'm sure, are the way you're able to attract those new staff members now. So,
well, staff, and then just an addition is that the partnerships we have with community agencies is really how we intentionally gained trust by those populations. And so that was some of the first outreach we did this spring, to say we're going to be opening again. It's ticketed, and that's complicated with families in underserved families. So how can we do this in a way that they're going to know they're welcome and they come? And we worked very closely with them, and they were so happy to hear from us. And they also, they've been through their own journeys through all of this. So they were really thrilled to have the partnership come back very easily.
sure. If I recall in one of our earlier conversations, because I know that you're in an urban center, and is it a Y facility, but that you just had never had, they're like across the street, and it just had never happened. So just tell that little story if you would.
Yeah, the YWCA is across the street. And when I arrived 8 years ago, the families weren't visiting, and they get in free. And this is 133 individuals with about 60 children under the age of 8 in that major building. They weren't visiting. So it's 62 steps. I walked on over there, knocked on the door, and met with the director and said, why aren't you coming? Why aren't your clients coming? And we identified, racism was a key part of it. The way they felt when they arrived, the way our other visitors treated them, the way our staff behaved, the way they had to pull out their poor card to show to get in. They had to say, and so basically we completely changed our access system to not cause poverty shaming, to basically, you don't have to show us your documents. We ask you to say why you qualify based on our eligibility criteria, but we changed the way the cards look, so they look just like memberships other people have. And we also invited them, and other partners like this to come to things that would help them get comfortable in the space. And we went there with programming. And so it really rebuilt into where we're neighbors, we're family now, we feel like, with that population, and they feel that way with us too. We've hired staff from women who live there at the Y who work for us. And it really took a long effort, but it took noticing what's the problem here, and being willing to listen to it with an open mind and not being defensive.
Right. And I think you're in, having worked with children's museums and children's theaters, in my career, it's challenging because your audience is always growing out. And so having those relationships with organizations and channels and other institutions is really important, because your one-on-one relationships, are going to go away until they have their kids and hopefully bring them back. So,
well, and they have organizational behavior just like we do. So once there's a culture in that organization about thinking of the Children's Museum as a partner and neighbor and friend, then that transmits to new people. One of the things they also told us is they really don't use the parks nearby, so those kids are not getting out in nature. They really wish they had a backyard, and our thinking in this new space that we're creating out back is it's their backyard.
Great, yeah, lovely. Great. Let's see, I think we've kind of gone through, Deb, a lot of the questions, but is there anything else that I haven't asked that you think touches on these issues around, being at a crossroads, making transitions, making changes that you'd like to share that I have forgotten to ask you about?
One of the things that stands out to me is that there was a small group of our leadership team who just went so far above and beyond. And it wasn't, they always do, but it really stood out in this case. And it wasn't so much that they worked all the time. It was more that they thought outside the box, and we gave each other the room to do that and didn't go down in the weeds all the time. We did that visioning time constantly. What if we did this? What if we did that? And then made decisions about it. And we're really agile about how we approach things. And I think that made all the difference, having a little crew of people who really were able to make that happen. And so they were the ones I also needed to be sure I tried to take care of through this, to make sure they're getting what they need, because they also were doing that for the rest of the staff.
Credit where credit's due. That's great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Deb. This has just been a pleasure to talk with you, and really appreciate your sharing so much of your story and your wisdom, and you know, the things that you recognized needed to be fixed, and how you went about that. I think that people will really appreciate hearing your story. So thanks for taking the time.
Well, thank you, Molly. We are so grateful for how the Madison Children's Museum has been able to come through this, and how the community came together to make that happen.
Great.